welcome to this online training that we are organizing as part of CIVITAS. And for those that are new to CIVITAS, we will explain what it is a bit later. The topic today is creating attractive cities through parking management and access regulation schemes. We have some great program prepared for you, with some great speakers. We have some ways of interaction. We have some group work prepared. So quite a menu for the coming hours. For those in different time zones that are approaching the evening, I hope you can sit it out and enjoy this training as well. What we have on the menu for today, so this is, well, European or, well, Amsterdam time zone. So we are now at 9:15 or 9:19. So we will run up to 12:30. We are now welcoming you. I will introduce CIVITAS for a bit and this training. We will touch upon parking management. Urban vehicle access regulations will follow on that. So these are more presentation and plenary exercises. And we will continue with some group work. We have some speakers, but I will invite them to introduce themselves when starting their presentations. But first, let's start with a welcome. Let's head to Mentimeter. So Annette will click a link. We'll share a link in the chat. And I will put the Menti on the screen, so you can also scan the QR code and then access the Mentimeter. And now I have to, or is that? Yeah. I put it on standby, and let's go to the first one, because we are very curious where you are from, of course. I'm located in the Netherlands. My colleague Swanette is our guest speaker, our key partner in delivering this training, I must say. It's Cosimo. He is located in Lecce, is it right? In Italy.
Yeah, southern Italy.
Yes, yeah.
The hill.
And this is good. Yeah. And what I already introduced is I just concluded a session with a group from the Philippines, and I invited them as well, because these kind of trainings are really open to anyone, and yeah, it's really great to having you here. And at the same time, we are welcoming Moldova, Ireland. I already saw you, Neve. Nice having you again. Austria, Netherlands, Norway, Poland, India again. I saw Amita. Hi there, Amita. You were here.
Hello.
Hello. Italy, Iran as well. So yeah, I think I suppose this topic is not a European topic, but it's relevant for creating well, attractive and sustainable cities across the globe. Oh no, I have to let's click on the PowerPoint. So this is the type of organization you are affiliated with. So we have, it's a bit small on the screen, so that's, we have city authorities, other public bodies or other governmental organizations, NGOs. If you are from a university or so, you can hit academia, advocacy or volunteering groups, consultancies or engineers, private sector, perhaps a bus company or an engineer, not an engineering firm, or well, another private service provider, perhaps, or another organization. But now we are with a group of 29 at the moment. We have 17 responses. For those that are just logging in, take some time to hit the answer of your choice. It's also good to see that we have some representation on the left, so to say, some city authorities, other government, other public bodies. It's always good to see, and some good representation from academia. So that's also something you could consider. Eh? So we are sharing the recordings and the handouts afterwards. Yeah, and also feel free to use these materials also in your your teaching, in your curricula. So it's that's the material that's also a good outlet for these kind of materials. Yeah, I think this is quite close. We are at 29. Yes, so let's continue with the next one. Yeah, your learning objectives for today. So this is where we can already start to manage your expectations. So if you're here to learn about, let's say traffic education, then we have nothing here to tell you about today. Or if you are here to learn about, yeah, I've already think if I say mobility as a service, it's, well, it's not mass that we are heading upon, but there are some relationships with parking management or UVAs. No, but just yeah, just share your learning objectives. It's also interesting to see yeah, what your peers are here to learn about. Yeah, parking traffic in general, parking management. This is an important one to learn about parking management as a mobility tool. That's an interesting one. Overview of parking management. How? Yes, yeah, that's actually the key of this training, together with yeah, traffic calming or access regulation schemes to create attractive cities. So if you're into cycling, this is also relevant. Eh? So if you're building cycling or designing cycling lanes, then one of the issues, one of the first issues is, okay, what to do with parking? Well, this is another perspective, but it's also a relevant one if you are into planning and design for cycling. The same for vehicle access regulation schemes. So one of effective measures for cycling is also traffic calming. So not so much, of course, next to designing good quality infrastructure, traffic calming is also an important element in creating successful cycling. Where to locate parking considerations, dealing with parking, open streets, smart mobility in crowded cities. That is perhaps, well, related. It's not the key topic that we will address today. City dwelling to attractive spaces. Yeah. Very important one. I think, yeah, it's I think we will be touching upon not any, almost any, every topic, right, Cosimo? I think you can relate to this topic, and Tom will do so for parking. I have one or two. Yeah. If we are creating attractive cities, to your opinion, what is the best tool? Perhaps without the tool, perhaps without knowing the exact details, but what do you think, parking or access regulation schemes?
Ooh.
Oh? Ah, here are the parking managers. The parking advocates. Okay, so we well, quite a group on the access regulation schemes. And then, of course, it's perhaps some of are still contemplating or thinking, but it's good to keep in mind. So if we would say, well, it's in the name, regulating access, vehicle access. So if we disallow vehicles to access certain parts of the city, then we also have to think where do we allow to have them, and where do we allow to park them? So that is something to keep in mind today. Yeah, so this is about the Mentimeter. A little bit about CIVITAS and the CIVITAS training. So before we really dig into the content, yeah, I was thinking, okay, what to include about CIVITAS, but the logo or the new logo basically says it all. So it's an initiative to promote or facilitate sustainable and smart mobility for all. So it's a European Union initiative, European Commission initiative. So basically it is, CIVITAS is the label for, the policy label for urban mobility policy. Urban mobility is considered as in a broad way. So we are covering various thematic areas, active mobility, the softer side, behavioral change, but also the harder, the more tangible sides, perhaps cleaner and energy efficient vehicles, up to public transport, smart mobility, road safety and security, also urban logistics, not to forget. So it's not just people, but it is also goods. And in the end, in the past, what is it, 19 years, many cities have implemented or trialed so-called measures or projects, more than 900 projects across these areas. So we've been doing this in 6 phases. So it's all cities and universities and companies working together. It's a network of cities with more than 340 members that have joined us. The actual work is conducted through projects, so 3, 4, 5-year projects, and it's a lot about testing and experimenting with mobility measures or with projects. So CIVITAS is not putting the big investment in, for example, bus rapid transport systems or big infrastructure projects. Now it is doing first pilots to evaluate it, to learn from that, to take learnings from that, and to disseminate it through, amongst others, these kind of trainings. So you can learn a lot from what's been done the past small 20 years. And you can access a lot of these learning materials and capacity building activities through civitas.eu. You can also find further information about the initiative as such, and also about funding possibilities. Learning materials are available here. So under Learning and Resources and Learning Center. I highlighted there. So it's recordings, it's e-courses, it's live events, upcoming study tours. So I really invite you to take a look at it here. Today is about creating attractive cities. And why did we organize this training? When we create attractive cities, one way to do so is, well, there's a lot of modes to consider. It's pedestrian, cyclist, public transport, motorized traffic. But somehow we need to find our ways to prioritize here and there. That comes down to certain choices in the end, where to, also for vehicles in this case, where to have them, where not to have them. That is an important mechanism, or these are important choices that in the end lead to creating attractive cities. And the way how to do that, we have some tools for that, which we can call parking management and access regulation schemes. So there's, it holds some physical interventions, enforcement interventions, and these are also really powerful tools that really can steer where we locate, where we put our motorized traffic in the cities, and where we can get this traffic out to create more places, create more squares, create more spaces for terraces, for shops, etc., etc. So this is where this training is all about today. So we will introduce you to the concepts of parking management and access regulations. They are abbreviated to UVARs, Urban Vehicle Access Regulations. There are some examples, ideas, theories, concepts behind this. We will introduce this today. And through these presentations, our exercises, etc., we will try to help you to understand the basic principles of these tools, how these tools fit in the bigger picture of creating our attractive cities, or perhaps creating more favorable cities for cycling, for active modes, for other purposes, but summarized as creating attractive cities. And to help you to understand some key approaches to apply these tools. So that is what our promise is from us to you. And our lineup will deliver this promise. I will guide and help to facilitate the overall training, but we have two great experts here. Tom Rye, is Tom here already? Yes? Okay, great having you, Tom. And we have Cosimo Shifi. They both are involved in CIVITAS related work. All these CIVITAS projects have names. Cosimo is involved in CIVITAS Reveal. Tom is involved in Park for Samp. SUMP is Sustainable Urban Mobility Planning. He will explain the link between parking and planning, of course. Tom is working for the Urban Research Institute on Urban Mobility in Slovenia. Cosimo is working for a company called TRT, which is located in Italy. And Swanette is my colleague at DTV Consultants. And we together work in a project called CIVITAS Elevate, and it is CIVITAS Elevate that is organizing this training. We do a lot of training at DTV capacity building. We will include this in the handout. But this is where I would like to hand over to Tom.
All right. Thanks very much for the introduction, Taya. I'm Tom Rye. I'm from the Urban Planning Institute of Slovenia, although I'm not Slovenian and I don't live in Slovenia, but don't let that, I won't let that get in my way. I'm also a professor of transport policy at a place called Molde University College in Norway, amongst other things. And I've been working on parking management both as an academic and a practitioner for, I don't know, at least 15 years. Something like that, in the context of parking as a policy-making tool for sustainability. Yeah, just my presentation structure. I just want to go through why parking is important, its impact on mobility, a few inspiring examples maybe, public acceptability issues. We've got a few minutes for that just before 11 o'clock, but it's absolutely crucial, public acceptability in the parking context. And links to more information, mainly from the Park for Samp project, which is a park project that I'm involved with, but also some other information which I rate extremely highly that I'll tell you about later. And by the way, that's just an acknowledgement of all the lovely people around Europe who've given me permission to use graphics in this presentation. So why is parking important? Well, essentially, sustainable urban mobility plans that work, and when I say that they work, I mean that they change the way that people travel in a more sustainable direction away from a private car. They include parking management. There's no getting away from it. So the other thing is parking is clearly linked to car use. The availability of parking space influences how people use the car. There's the issue that on-street parking is public space. So if it takes up that space, you can't use it for something else. And also, because it's public space, people get upset about it. It's an inherently political issue, and that's why it's important and interesting. So interesting and important from a practical point of view, interesting and important from an academic point of view as well. In fact, I've just got a new research project in Norway about how people accept or don't accept controversial measures in sustainable urban mobility plans, including parking management. There's also a very perceived close link to the local economy. So politicians, as we say in English, they get their ear bent by local traders, businesses saying we haven't got enough parking. And also people are used to using this private public space for free for parking in many places. So when you start not allowing them to use it for free or putting some time limits on it and so on, then yeah, it becomes a controversial issue. Yeah, in SUMP, some kind of push measure, that is a measure that is a little bit of a disincentive for people to use the private car, is needed. If you don't have that push measure, then what you get is changes between cycling and public transport. So maybe some people will use more public transport, or some people will use more cycling or more walking, but the level of car use stays roughly the same. If you want to cut that level of car use, you need a push measure, and parking management is by far the most common. Although there's also urban vehicle access restrictions, which Cosimo is going to talk about, and maybe he has a similar map showing how many of them there are around Europe. But I mean, in terms of parking management, there are many cities all over the world. I know we have somebody from Iran today. I used to have a student from Iran. He gave me a case study of parking management in Shiraz in Iran. Right, you know, parking management is done everywhere. On the other hand, road pricing, which academics love because it's about transport economics, there's almost no examples of road pricing when you look at a map of Europe. There's a bit limited, that map. There should be a few more dots in Norway, but it gives you the basic idea. So parking management, well accepted, quickly implemented, doesn't often require much investment. Road pricing and congestion charging, the opposite. Some that work include parking management. This is some recent work that myself and colleagues at UIRS did, where we contacted these various cities that we thought had probably changed the way that people traveled, and said, well, have you got some data on how people have changed the way they travel? And they said, yes, we do. So there's the green bar is how the proportion of trips, it's not kilometers, it's trips by car in the city. And you could see that basically the average at the beginning of the implementation of these SUMPs was about 50% of trips by car, which fell to about 35%. So some of them are super low. You can see there, like Freiburg down to 20%, Vienna 25% or something, 28%. But that's the data we got from them. We said, well, how did you do this? And they said, well, we made the alternatives better, and we made it a little bit more difficult to travel by car, and fundamental in that was parking management. So if you want to bring about this kind of change, yeah, parking management. And there's just some more results from Munich. So you can see that the change in long-term parking and overnight parking and reduction in car use. So if you have a reduction in the actual occupancy of the car parking space, that means that you can start to do something else with it. But then also you've got an increase in the sustainable modes. And you get a kind of congestion because people don't have to look so long for a parking space, those who still want a parking space. So you can see that fall in Vienna in the early 2000s in District 69. They cut parking search time by a third, and obviously that means fewer people driving around looking for a parking space. Similar kind of idea in Belgrade, which introduced its controlled parking zone in about 2014, I think. And you can see that the proportion of people not searching for a space or searching for just a few seconds went up from 40% to 60%. The people who were looking for more than 10 minutes fell from a third to 12%. So, you know, it's clear parking management influences the way that people travel, and it also cuts congestion. And we also have to think about the proportion of public space that is occupied by parking. And basically this slightly complicated graph shows what it says in the green box, which is while cars account for less than 50% of the modal split, they occupy 92% of the public space that is devoted to stationary traffic. So we're not talking about pavements here or footways or sidewalks as a space for traffic for pedestrians. We're just talking about benches and places to sit as stationary traffic, right? And yeah, cars occupy by far the biggest proportion of that public space. Yeah, in terms of the transport terms, in Graz in Austria here, only 47% of trips. A key issue, parking and the local economy, where your local businesses, they go, we must have parking. If we don't have parking, we will die. Right? Well, number one, it's been well demonstrated. This is old data, but I've done my own surveys that show similar kind of results. Shopkeepers always overestimate the proportion of their travellers who come by car, their customers who come by car. So in this example, the shopkeepers thought it was 58% customers coming by car. In fact, it was 32%. And they thought it was 25% on foot. In fact, it was 44%. And in cities, in high density cities, really high density cities, then this portion coming on foot will be even higher. And then basically this graph shows that people who visit the most shops are those who come on foot and by bus and by bike, and people who come by car visit fewer shops, which kind of makes sense because they try and find a parking space near to that shop, go to the shop, go back to their car, whereas people on foot kind of wander around. And removing parking can boost economic performance. This is a street in Krakow in Poland, which within the last 4 years or so was changed. You can see there from a place where some people could park. That is actually, the top photo is part of an urban access restriction zone. But a lot of people had a permit to get into that urban access restriction zone and park. The urban access restriction zone was rather more strictly enforced in the after situation, basically the street which leads from the city square to the main castle, the only castle in Krakow, became entirely pedestrian. Before and after, there was lower acceptance by the shopkeepers and businesses in the before situation. Afterwards, they quickly accepted it because, of course, footfall, the number of people walking on the street increased, and it became a more pleasant place to be, so they stayed for longer. And that meant that shop and restaurant rents quickly increased. And then here's a bit of work that I did, and this was a long time ago, and I do really need to repeat this work now, especially in the light of online shopping. But when I did this work back in 2005, what I did was I looked at retail centres, that's in city centres and town centres around Great Britain. And there was a retail ranking which basically demonstrated how successful those centres were in shopping terms. How, you know, 1 is the best, right? There isn't a 0, but 1 is the best. There doesn't need to be a 1, does there? Anyway, the higher the number, the lower the number, the better performing the centre. And then I looked at how much public parking they had available on street and off street public. Oh, sorry, just off street public parking, and tried to plot a relationship. And effectively, there's no relationship. The more parking that there is per square metre of shopping floor space doesn't make any difference to the performance of the shopping centre. And I also plotted it against parking price per hour, and there was a negative relationship. So the higher the price, the better performing the shopping centre, which kind of seems a bit counterintuitive, but then you think, well, okay, so the shopping centres that are successful actually are able to charge more for parking because they're successful. So this is old research, but a colleague of mine in the Netherlands has done a lot more recent research and also finds a similar kind of pattern, that parking is not a major issue in people's choice of comparison retail destination. Right? There are certain types of retail, like, for example, some supermarkets, major supermarkets, where, yeah, whether or not there's parking available is important, but for most shopping, it's the range of shops available and the sort of experience, what it's like to shop, that's the key thing. You know, decide where to shop. So parking is a lot less important in retail performance than shopkeepers and politicians tend to think. I'll see if I've probably got some time for some inspiring examples. Some inspiring examples of some cities around Europe that have changed parking. So in Vitoria in Spain, which in general is a very interesting city and very inspiring in many of its policies, not just in sustainable transport, but sustainability in general. Vitoria introduced a new parking policy. in 2008, and you can see that by 2012 they'd increased parking in the orange zone the cost from €0 to €2.70 an hour, and they similar kind of increase in the other zones, not quite as much in the dark blue. But the point is that they increased the price of parking very quickly, and they also extended the area of controlled parking. Although I should say that's not a particularly big area of distance. That's probably 1.5 kilometres from east to west and 2 kilometres from north to south maximum. And there's still a lot of parking outside that area that's not controlled. It's free to park on the street outside that area. But they made some very significant changes to the way that a few of their key streets were laid out in terms of parking. They turned these big avenues that used to be completely dominated by parking. You can see the top right picture there, that you've effectively got 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 lanes of on-street parking on that street. And they completely remodeled the street. And the main way they remodeled it is by removing almost all the on-street parking. So in the after situation, there's not actually much less space for moving traffic, but there's a lot less space for parking, split out from 5 lanes of on-street parking to 1 lane of on-street parking. Now you may well say, well, where did they put this on-street parking that used to be there? At the same time as doing this project, they did open a couple of extra underground car parks. However, I've done quite a lot of work in Victoria Gasteiz on parking, and these off-street car parks are very, very underused. So people don't park in them. So they were actually a bit of a waste of money. But the people who used to park here on the street now park just a bit further out of town, basically, and walk in and maybe scoot in or cycle in. So if you are taking, there's a lesson from that, which is if you are in a situation where you're removing parking from the street, don't automatically assume that you must replace it with new off-street parking, because frequently that off-street parking is underused, and instead people find other on-street opportunities further out, and eventually they think, oh well, this isn't worth it, so I'll just change mode. So Victoria Gasteiz was one of the cities I showed earlier where they had significantly changed the way that people travel. And there's just some other examples of more local streets where they changed the configuration of parking, removed parking basically, and used the space for other things. Vienna is a very good example of how they've increased the number of parking spaces that are subject to on-street parking management over time. It brings them in a lot of money, but that's perhaps not the most important thing. You can see that the majority of the city is now covered by on-street parking controls, and it's interesting to see that after they extended the zone, then there's much less problems with over demand or high demand for parking space than in the previous situation. The parking space management in Vienna has been really, really important to help them towards the target of 20% of all trips by car. They're at about 25% at the moment, but they're moving towards 20% of all trips by car, which is amazing for a city of over 1 million people. Yeah, long-term parkers move away from spaces on the street once they're controlled. There's a decrease in parking search traffic, but also the number of parking offences has declined, so there's better compliance with the parking space management when it's properly done. So they're a very good example. I'll skip over this example actually. It's something a bit more interesting. Improved enforcement. I know that in many of the cities that you're from, enforcement is an issue, and parking management, on-street parking management in particular, doesn't work very well if you don't have good enforcement. Is it possible to improve enforcement? Well, I've got a couple of examples here. One's from Slovenia, Ljubljana, where when I first started going to Ljubljana in about 2006, there was no parking management and no enforcement. But kind of overnight in about 2011, because of a political decision, and there's no getting away from it, it was a political decision, then enforcement was introduced, and suddenly cars that were illegally parked started getting clamped and towed and fined. And well, was there public uproar against this? Well, actually, ultimately no, because Ljubljana has transformed its city centre and made that hugely economically successful, but also a really popular place for local people to go. And parking management was part of that, because part of the transformation of the city was moving illegally parked cars. So there's an example of where, with the political will, parking management enforcement is possible to do. This is a situation of Istanbul. So you think Istanbul isn't necessarily the place you would automatically imagine to have parking enforcement, but the greater Istanbul municipality effectively took over parking management, particularly on the European side and some of the wealthier parts of the Asian side. It took it over from, well, informal parking enforcement operators, let's put it that way. Right, and it was able to do that because they created a lot of jobs, like this guy here, who's working as a he sells parking tickets and does some enforcement. And as a result, you know, of parking compliance with regulations, and when the delays to other traffic reduced. So it is possible to introduce enforcement in unlikely places. I showed you the example of Belgrade earlier. You know, not necessarily a place you would associate with the best parking enforcement, but I don't want to trade on national stereotypes. Their controlled parking zone works. It works because it has good enforcement. So it is possible. And also it's accepted because people realize that once the parking is, if you like, organized, sorted out, then life is better for everybody, including the people who are looking for a parking space. One final thing, it's possible in new development to reduce the amount of parking that is provided. Although I know that this is a vexed issue in many emerging economy cities where parking may not be provided, developers don't want to provide it, or parking that is provided is actually used for other uses like informal businesses and so on. But anyway, try to get away from the idea that you have to provide as much parking as possible to predict and provide a demand for parking in new development, and actually consider limiting that. So for a number of years in England, there were maximum parking standards, national maximum parking standards, which limited the amount of parking built with new developments. And the effect of this was, actually this is Scottish data, it's a similar kind of story, that suburban developments where without parking management, without maximum parking standards, without a limit on the amount of parking provided, those suburban developments, you would expect probably 95% of people to drive to work in those developments. In fact, you know, sort of 65%, 70%, 60% of people driving along to work in those developments. And parking standards, maximum parking standards, basically not providing a parking space for everybody who work there, played a big role in that. Accessibility, I will deal with at 10 to 11. I've come probably to the end of my presentation now. Is there time for any questions? I don't know, Taya.
Yeah, certainly there is. Well, there's a question coming in the chat by Diana May. Let me see if I can.
Can I elaborate on the connection between removing on-street parking spaces and the use of off-street parking? Yeah. But the main reason why off-street parking facilities would be underused, or were underused in Victoria, but it's not the only case. So, for example, Krakow as well, which I showed, they have one off-street car park. People don't find it as convenient, and often also the price of off-street parking is higher than the price of on-street parking. That's the wrong way to do it. But because there are construction costs associated with off-street parking, then the price is higher per hour. So, people don't particularly like off-street parking. It's not as convenient or nice as on-street. But also, if it's more expensive, then they'll much prefer to drive a little bit further out and park for free on street if they can. So that's their automatic response, I would say. But I know that isn't the case in all cities. So in some cities where there is very, very, very high parking demand, then yeah, off-street parking facilities are are used, but it's a typical experience that off-street parking facilities are underused. Many Western and Southern European cities certainly.
Does that help you, Diana? Okay, perfect.
And then what's better than clamping or towing? Generally, if a car is obstructing the movement of traffic or the movement of pedestrians, pedestrians being a form of traffic, then towing. But if it's not actually causing an obstruction, but it is a repeat offender, then clamping. Did I look into car sharing as part of parking policy? Not specifically. I mean, there is widespread experience of cities who donate, if you like, on-street parking spaces to car sharing companies, and I think that's good practice when the car sharing companies are just starting up. In a situation where you have an active car sharing industry with many different companies offering services in your city, then you have to start thinking about charging them for the on-street parking spaces, because there isn't any particular. But there's, I suppose, there's some motivation for giving them on-street parking spaces, but you know, they shouldn't be the first call on street parking spaces when you could use that on-street space for something more pleasant, like a cafe or some public space. But when car sharing is starting up, yeah, it really helps the car sharing companies if they can have access at low cost or zero cost to some dedicated on-street parking spaces.
Yeah, good to also flag the development of sharing schemes and how that relates to parking. I also have a question for you, Tom. Parking management implies several interventions, and putting it all together. You mentioned a couple of these interventions. Could you help us out and summarize these typical interventions, and also explain whether there's a sort of hierarchy, what to do first, what comes next, etc.?
Okay. Yeah, effectively, your parking policy has to decide which uses and users are your priority uses and users, and then implement some measures which ensure that those uses and users have priority access to limited curb space where demand for that curb space exceeds supply. So effectively, you're thinking about time limits on the use of certain curb space for parking. You might be looking about prohibitions of parking on certain bits of curb space where there are safety problems, and then obviously charging, different levels of charging for different types of user or different types of vehicle, time limits for how long people can stay even if they're paying, and then ultimately permit schemes for certain types of users so that they get preferential access or can stay for longer and for cheaper on certain types of parking. Pricing of street parking so it's cheaper than on-street parking is really critical, and then maximum parking standards for new buildings is in the long term a really crucial thing to do.
Okay, thanks for this. Let's do one more question and then continue with Cosimo. It's a question by Mia in the chat, Tom. Did you see it already?
Yeah, I see it, but I don't totally understand the question. Sorry. Parking areas utilize pedestrian walkways in some cities. The parking fee imposed by city government. Any comparisons?
Mia, may I invite you to join the conversation or to explain a bit more about your question?
Hi. I was just wondering, the examples that you showed mainly showed parking that were actually on the streets, but when I bike around through cities in Metro Manila, in the Philippines, I noticed that some of the parking where fees are actually collected are imposed by the city government, and they're actually on pedestrian walkways, not
okay.
not on the street. So
yeah.
your
So you mean
thoughts or your comments?
Well, yeah. I think that's, well, the pedestrian walkway should be for pedestrians, obviously. And the city government there is taking on, is effectively selling pedestrian space for parking revenue. And that reflects back to sort of a political will issue, really. And that's all I can say on that. It's clearly wrong, right? But because there's revenue involved, then the city is saying, well, we can collect revenue from the people who are parked on this pedestrian area. We can't collect revenue from the pedestrians. I think what I would encourage the city government to consider is, well, okay, there's road space that we can actually convert to on-street parking, and we can collect revenue from that, and leave the pedestrian space for pedestrians.
Actually, both is currently being utilized for that purpose. So there is parking that's taken off the road space, but I've also noticed the pedestrian space being also used as parking. So yes, for pedestrian and also the road. And interestingly, I took note of when you said that the people don't use the off-street parking often because it's more expensive in one of your cases. I've also noticed, for at least for some districts, not in my city, thankfully, that the on-street parking is actually more expensive than the off-street parking.
Well, as
a matter of observation.
Yeah. It's not. I'm not saying in all cases that on-street parking is cheaper than off-street parking, but in many cases it is. If in your city it's more expensive to park on street, well, that's good from a policy point of view.
Okay, thanks for your question, Mia. Tom, thanks for answering. As just already highlighted by Tom, acceptability is an important element. We will be touching upon that later, but we first go to Cosimo. Let me see. Together, there you are. Yeah, you have put your presentation there, so floor is yours, Cosimo.
Thank you. Thank you, Taye. So let's start. Just a quick reference to the question before. In the city of Milan, for example, still is allowed to park on sidewalks, because in some areas sidewalks are quite wide, and so there's also this complexity of people trying to find the park and the sidewalks just in front of the doors. And it's a controversial measure that is quite well discussed in the city of Milan. But let's move to another topic, that is the one on access regulation, that is more or less also linked to parking. I will go very quickly in just giving you a website of the Reveal project. That is a project, that CIVITAS project, that is dealing with this topic. That we are just trying to demonstrate, or just to analyze how UVARs can become also a standard range of urban mobility options to help cities being more sustainable. Apart from that is the partnership. We have some cities, the city of London, Vittoria Gasteiz, Bielefeld in Germany, Helmond in the Netherlands, Padua in Italy, and the city of Jerusalem, with a number of also consultants. I work for TRT, is one of the consultancy that is partnering into this project. The approach of the project is much more dealing with those that we call measure fields, so exactly typologies of UVARs, but also combining spatial interventions, some future options, pricing, of course, and we try to deal with those elements that can really accelerate the change, that are those that we call transition areas: governance and financing, user needs acceptance, mobility concept or supporting measures, and of course also technology. You can find on the website also a series of webinars that we organized, and they are free and on demand. You can watch the webinars to learn more about these transition areas. The origins, well, we started, we all know that at the very beginning, let's say the city was entirely, in general, a public space, a shared space. But then something really changed dramatically, how our relation with the public space and with the city in general, because of motorization and because of mobility. So we started in distinguishing between footways, roadways. We had to accommodate, let's say, different needs and different traffic flows. There was, yeah, this evolution in diversifying transport modes, segregating, but luckily we are now coming back to another era in which we are trying to reverse this concept and try to have another approach to city. I'm Italian, and so of course you will see how many UVARs are already implemented in Italy, and in let's say in 1965, but there were already talks into the city council of Siena about the presence, the increasing presence of cars into the medieval towns. You know, the majority of Italian cities are not suited for cars, are really not suited. I'm also meaning not only the big ones, but also the small ones. Unfortunately, we had a massive impact from the presence of cars into our old towns, city centers. And in the city of Siena, there was a visionary mayor called Fazio Fabbrini. I will maybe type later on an article, an interesting article, who introduced an UVAR limited traffic zone for the first time in Italy, and that was maybe one of the earliest in Europe, when they try to think about the relationship between the space and the role of motorized vehicles. That is, in fact, his thoughts that led him just having an ordinance, a mayoral ordinance, that is also was quite risky for him. And you will have this web link to an article where this story is also presented. Some definitions and typologies. On our website, you can find also a glossary. Let's start with UVAR. Now, this term is increasingly used in a number of policy documents, strategies, etc. So that's me. It's urban vehicle access regulation, and we used to refer to access regulation, and it's a measure to regulate vehicular access to urban infrastructure. This is the very simple definition, and well, it determines under what conditions certain vehicles are allowed to access certain or use certain parts of the cities. Normally, we have elements or conditions that are related to vehicle weight or size, time, periods of time of the day, time of the week, the user categories, we'll see why. Emission levels, increasingly important, or for example, the payment of or the charging for access certain roads or certain areas, or the occupancy level of a vehicle. We tend to say that UVAR, the R stands for regulation and not restrictions, but all in all, these are, of course, restrictions. The well-known typologies are the limited traffic zones, low emission zones, congestion charge, but also pedestrian areas and also parking regulations are part of the UVERS. I will focus more on some of them, so on the most crucial ones. I have personal experience of both design and implementation of a limited traffic zone, and this is also because in Italy we have the higher concentration of schemes. As you can see, almost every historical city and town has an access regulation in place since many years, and the majority of them are also enforced with cameras. But of course, in Europe, there's this growing interest in pushing also the elements of cleaning certain areas, so giving priority or access only to cleaner vehicles. So we tend also to talk about low emission zone. We will see that it's not clear, the difference. It's really blurred. And we have some schemes of urban road tolls, as Tom said before. There are some more dots, but there are really just a few of them. The majority are also the blue dots, or also the orange ones and the green ones. The orange are those in terms of called seasonal or pollution emergency schemes. There's also this concept of zero emission zone. I personally do not like it, because I think we have already some very basic UVERs. Here you can see some of the, of course, of the most well-known typologies of UVERs. I would like to start from exactly, let's say, the most relevant one, where that is pedestrian or car-free zone. Here, I think that sometimes we forget to focus on the correct wording. Saying pedestrian area, pedestrian zone is much more important and clear, other than having the focus on cars or a car-free. There's a difference in terms of implementation, because it's also a matter of how concretely some such areas are protected from motorized vehicles. Sometimes, in fact, pedestrians are totally banned because of physical barriers or characteristics of the area. We'll see. In some other cases, here, for example, you can see a road sign in Italy. Residents can access their garage, for example, their house, but there are also during some time windows, delivery operations allowed in bigger pedestrian areas. But it's also true that in some other cases you can have less, let's say, restriction in such terms, and they tend to refer to car-free. This is Varna. In Varna, for example, there's a magnificent and marvelous pedestrian area. As you can see, it's a built environment, rebuilt environment. It was there since many years. It's not something that they rebuilt because they removed cars. It's already there. And when I was there visiting the city for CIVITAS, I noticed that this was because simply vehicles cannot access that part of the city. There's there are some concrete bollards that prevent this access, also for emergency vehicles that are maybe allowed only through certain limited part, or greeneries, for example. This is the case of Ghent in Belgium, where, I don't know if you know, but there's a circulation plan in place that is kind of bigger limited traffic zone, but the core is called car-free area. There are, of course, 5 different car-free areas with some gates, and normally these gates are made of moving bollards, and they also have some totally pedestrianized streets in a way that nobody can enter, but they tend to refer to car-free because residents can access the area, can reach the area, but they have totally banned on-street parking, and that's why also, let's say, the perception is different, and that's why we refer to car-free. Of course, however, as always, you need to properly design such kind of intervention, because some supporting measures are fundamental for the functioning. Yeah, exactly. In some bigger pedestrian areas, you can have these walking buses or people movers. These are exactly the case of Ghent. Some free shuttle services from some parking for the parking right. The parking, of course, the off-street parking, you have to pay for parking your car, but you do not pay to reach the city center. Also, the time of the service is important. The policy on parking, the provision of bicycles, for example. This is really something that can help in pushing also people in accepting a policy like pedestrianization. Then we tend to have also this attention on spatial intervention that, of course, it's also embed a concept of access regulation. It's, of course, planning the area, design intervention, changing the structure, the entire environment sometimes. And of course, we can have micro scale or macro scale elements, like, for example, the well-known super blocks or superia in Spain. Of course, there's also these elements of passing from having a coexistence of people and vehicles in traffic calmed areas, or to exclusively redesign these such areas as public spaces. Of course, this is something that largely depends on the type of the area in which you have to act. Sometimes the use and the perception can change a lot, because for example, for some measure, you can simply issue a traffic ordinance, close a street in which there's an event, even if, for example, in some cities like, for example, in Italy, in Rome, but also in Bologna, they tend to close permanently some streets every weekend. And yeah, they enforce it with just some moving barriers, nothing really special. There's a use of the road space also for with the weekly on-street markets in Milan. That is something that really create a vibrant community, and it happens every time, and there are no particular or complex, let's say, implementation. It's something that of course, also the people, the residents, they know which streets are closed and when, and so they also adapt the way they park, also being, for example, residents. But you can also close streets in front of the schools. These are, again, UVARs, maybe applying some tactical urbanism interventions, or as also Taye said, the traffic calming is also a way of limiting the space and creating also a different sharing of the road space. In Vittoria Gasteiz, this is one of the partners of the reveal. As you can see here, is a recent transformation. You can have, for example, a portion of the road space in a district where they designed, for example, to reinvent the area, but they saved also partly a little and narrow streets to allow some vehicles to reach their garages. So this is also a combination of a spatial intervention with some regulation on who can access that garage, etc. So there's quite always a combination of rules and design elements. I would like to specify and also to give you this, just this focus on limited traffic zone and low emission zone. Sometimes especially in Europe, we tend to give now more importance to the term of low emission zone, ultra low emission zone, or zero emission. So the focus is on the level of emissions of the vehicles entering the zone. Have to meet certain standards. And in a limited traffic zone, the concept is totally different, because we restrict the number of vehicles enter the zone to certain user categories or vehicle categories. So of course the approach is totally different, because in the first case your aim is to reduce emission, even if in the majority of the case they would also like to reduce the number of vehicles. But in limited traffic zone, this happened immediately because there's a matter. So the urgency is to limit the access, to limit the presence of motorized vehicles, etc. And of course, for having more attractive cities, this is very important. This is what I already said. Basically, when you have a LEDs, you simply accelerate the renewal process of the fleet using that part of the city. On the other hand, in limited traffic zone, the concept is that, or the philosophy is that some trips, motorized trips, are not needed, are not essential, so can be restricted. It's a matter of forcing people to use other transport modes when some conditions are not met, when people are not safe, when the road space is occupied by cars, and is happened in many Italian cities. It's also, I have to tell you that nowadays, when you heard about low emission zone, sometimes it's in practice a limited traffic zone. So it's a matter of terminology other than on how they apply this. For example, in Bologna, we have a limited traffic zone, but they have already embedded a phasing out process of most polluting vehicles. Of course, this related to the ones who can have a permit, so who are allowed to enter. So they can enter, but they need to be to own a cleaner vehicle. In Lisbon, for example, the same. This is the new limited traffic zone and low emission zone that is active 6:30 till midnight. There are just a few user categories. They will need to meet certain standards. There are time windows for certain activities like delivery. And as you can see, sometimes in the majority of the cases, the policy is linked also not only to the access to the area, but also to parking. If you are authorized to park in the area or not, if you own a garage, we'll see also why. So in practice, this is promoted as a low emission zone. It's true because it's low emission, but let's say formally, structurally, it is a limited traffic zone. On the website, here you can see the link. There's also an interesting tool in which they made quite visible to the people, to the citizen, why they intend to introduce such type of measure, also because they are removing a lot of parking spaces. There are also quite, there are several ways of indicating limited traffic zone in the different languages. Sometimes the focus is correctly on traffic and on circulation. Sometimes they refer to low emission zone a fiable emission, or other terms that are more or less the same, but still in Europe there's not, let's say, they are not homogeneous, even if there are some policy initiatives in place in order to also to clarify the schemes. I would like also to give you a focus on how when we refer to exemptions and permits, why and which are the elements that are relevant to be known. This is also because in low emission zones, so the implementers, I mean, especially those, the majority of the cities in Germany, for example, or in the UK, still also in Spain, in Barcelona, they tend to refer to exemption. An exemption is my vehicle is a cleaner one, so I can enter. But if I own a polluting vehicle, maybe there are exemptions. There are those who, are allowed to enter. And there are some elements in which they tend to consider if there's a disproportionate effort to meet the standard, because, for example, I own an old vehicle for a very special intervention, like a crane or a military vehicle, something like this, or the emergency vehicle. Normally they are exempted, so they do not have to meet the standard. But when we look at the list of exemptions, we can see that sometimes some key roads are, for example, excluded from the scheme. As I said, there are some typology of vehicles, but still there are also situations in which low-income residents, for example, or cannot meet the standard, and this of course affect a lot the effectiveness of the scheme. Retrofitted vehicles, or there is also a timing in the implementation. As you can see, the people owning a blue badge, so disabled people. And there might be that in some schemes you can also purchase an exemption. These are pricing, purely pricing measures. In a limited traffic zone, we tend to distinguish between exemptions and permits. Exemptions are those that can be implemented very rapidly. So it means that some vehicles are automatically included in the system and are excluded from the limitation. As you can see, there are some really basic categories, like public transport, for example, or some postal services or utility vehicles, etc. So they do not have to do an action that is the request a permit. Because all the other categories that are set in the regulation are those that mostly have to demonstrate that they are eligible for a permit. And we tend to identify 4 main categories. So normally we can classify a permit according to the user's place of residence, the physical or health condition, like people with reduced mobility or people who need assistance. If there are regular and ongoing needs for access, like garage owners, for example, or occasional access. This is really something that distinguishes the way we identify and that you can find in every limited traffic zone. Of course, there are different ways of considering permits, distinguishing between permanent, temporary, or short-term. We will see why. And the main limited traffic zone permit holders. We have already demonstrated that the majority are mostly the same. There are different schemes, different ways of nominating limited traffic zones, sometimes indicating also them as low emission zone, but more or less the ones who need to have an authorization are these ones: the residents, garage owners, freight carriers, maintenance, servicing people with disabilities, caregivers, doctors, or public institutions. There are also some others in less restrictive schemes, but more or less these are the categories. There's a distinction between also those that are okay, they have an occasional, they will need an occasional permit. So you can see some visitors, for example, of the residents, and the residents can also request the permit for them, or clients of the hotels are other very common users of an LTZ. I will skip this, try to focus more on the other elements. I don't know if I'm on time, but I would like to save some more time for the questions. The elements, okay, the enforcement system. In Italy, we have a lot of ANPR cameras installed at the gates of the areas. But of course, you can have also moving bollards or RFID systems. This is the hardware of the system. Of course, you cannot have this. You can have also just a physical check with the police. But of course, now that technology is in place and is also quite cheap, at least in Italy, it is a measure that can be very easily implemented. Of course, you need to make some public works. You need to secure that you will have certain system installed at the gates. And in terms of NPR cameras that are also used for low emission zones, so they can recognize, for example, the emission standard of the vehicles, there's no physical interaction with the users. So you can simply install the cameras and watch and see what the systems can tell you about the people that have that had access. There are also other that are based on RFID, where you need to give them the possibility, or the moving bollards, you need to give to the user the possibility to enter. When I was in Burgos, for example, that is a mixed way of not having a camera or a moving bollard. Here there was not a camera, there are moving bollard, but for easily managing the permits, for example, because sometimes you can ring to the traffic control center and ask them that, for example, you have to do something there for an emergency, for an urgency, etc. So you do not have to go to the office to ask a permit. But there are also cameras controlling also when you enter, when you go out from the area, so you can be fined anyway. This is, for example, the combination of systems that are active in Burgos. The difference is that when you have an NPR, you can, and of course, a registry of the motorized vehicles, a national registry, you can recognize the existence of certain categories like public transport vehicles or cleaner vehicles, or some others, and then the system automatically exempts them from the possibility to be fined by the system. In all the other systems, when you have a limited traffic zone or a pedestrian area, but a limited traffic zone, you need a permit. You have to ask a permit and to go to the office to demonstrate that you are eligible for it. And sometimes you need to show it with a sticker, and it also sometimes is also happen for low emission zone. There's of course part of the building up a Uber system, an Uber scheme, is the permit management system. Nowadays, it's extremely easy. You can do it online, just uploading your documents, demonstrating you are eligible because you live, for example, in the area. These are two examples from Ghent. The parking permits and car-free area permits are exactly the same service. In Martina Franca in southern Italy, there's also a very easy tool where you can also access to obtain the different permits, and is online. In Pamplona, you can also download an app and ask for a 30 minutes entry access to the city center. This is only for urgent needs and occasional situations, so you cannot, of course, ask daily these type of services. And the signage is another component, is very important. It's still not harmonized in Europe. There's not a common sign for low emission zone. At UNECE level, of course, we have the red circle that normally is used also for limited traffic zone, but most of the time the cities tend to use also additional signage to clarify also the way the scheme is designed, both vertical and horizontal signs. And there's also an integration and a distinguishing, for example, you can see area B and area C. So there's the congestion charge, limited traffic zone in the city core of Milan, but area B is the low emission zone that is broader. You can find some guidance notes that we have drafted, including the ones where mostly the author of, I'm a co-author, is on exemption and permits on the CIVITAS reveal. There's a section on the notes of guidance, and I think, let's say, you can have some more details of what I presented. I hope I was in time. Thank you. And
yeah, thank you, Cosimo, for this wonderful and extensive overview UVARs. There's a lot of materials and resources available on the website of the Reveal project. The handouts of these slides will be provided, including all these links there. Just checking whether there's any questions. We have a break coming up, just to inform you all. Are there any questions at the moment? Let me see. Yeah, an important part, what I think is an important essence of what you've been presenting, Cosimo, is that we can see in many cities there's more attention for places, not so much for movement, but the relevance and importance of places is growing, and that we need to intervene and act upon that. So we want to dedicate or issue a certain use, which is more staying, nice places to be, nice places to visit, to live, shop, wander around. And through these mechanisms we've been hearing about, UVAR schemes and parking management, that we try to identify a certain use, a desired use, its users and its undesired users. And by putting and tailoring all these measures, we are trying to achieve these objectives. And it differs from city to city. But I think the important is what you've shown us, Cosimo, and also you, Tom, is there are some challenges with acceptability on these elements, because they really intervene with well, convenience, or what we perceive as convenient nowadays. But a lot of cities have done this, and there are some positive results. So I think that is also a good inspiration, or perhaps evidence, or provides arguments for those of you that are in cities that are perhaps just starting to consider these kind of measures. So thank you for this, Cosimo.
I would say that actually some of these arguments about the acceptability of and arguments for parking management, they also apply to urban access control zones, UVARs, and also to road pricing, and to an extent to any of these sort of controversial measures that involve some form of charging or some form of rationing of something that was some public space that was previously free. Public parking management is in itself is relatively acceptable. Yeah. So the percentage of acceptance by citizens, according to this project, this EU project portal, you shouldn't believe everything you read in the EU project, but this seems to be borne out by the academic literature as well. What this basically shows is that this line here is fuel, increasing fuel prices. This line here is road pricing, so making people pay for the road that they previously didn't have to pay for. And this line here is parking pricing. So and then these measures here are things like traffic calming and buses and what have you. So these measures don't include making people pay for anything extra, or rationing road space, or closing public space. These measures do. And by far and away the most publicly acceptable one of those three controversial, difficult measures is parking pricing, right? So it is relatively acceptable. Oh, interesting. I didn't know I had animation going on this. But then what can you do to make parking management more acceptable? Well, making sure that you communicate what you're going to do and explain the reasons for it. So, for example, in the Spanish city of Sevilla, I remember people there saying, well, you know, people realized that it was to make it easier to find a parking space as well as to free up some public space. And so communicate that to make it easier to find a parking space, and communicate how much you're going to pay and when you're going to pay and who's going to get a permit and how you apply for a permit. All the rules have to be communicated really, really clearly. Otherwise, people don't understand. And if they don't understand, they start putting myths around, especially on social media, and then the whole thing spirals out of control. So communicating what you're going to do very clearly and why you're going to do it is crucial. And then people will understand what you're doing and why. Explain the benefits of the measures. say, well, if people couldn't find a parking space easily, then that means that the shops can get the customer that they need. Make sure that the fees and the fines are related to the scale of the problem. So, for example, somebody who parks and obstructs the traffic of buses or pedestrians should pay a bigger fine than somebody who just overstays their stay on a parking meter where they've already paid something, but they stay for an extra 15 minutes by mistake. Right? And the scale of the hourly charge should be related to the size of the city and the size of the parking area and so on. It's useful to have alternative transport modes available, but I would say that in smaller cities especially, I know we've got some very, very, very big cities around, but in smaller cities especially, a key alternative transport mode is walking. Walking maybe from a parking space that's a bit further away. So if you improve the walking environment as a result of parking management or urban access zone, then you're actually making conditions for that alternative transport mode of walking much, much better, and that helps to build acceptability. When you generate money, which you will do, make it clear where the money will go. And that is an issue with some parking management schemes, without a doubt. It's not clear where the money will go. Make sure that enforcement is consistent and fair, so everybody knows they have an equal chance of getting a parking ticket. I did a training event in Greece once on parking, and they said, well, somebody from one city said, everybody knows the parking enforcers, there's only 2 of them, and they're all friends, and so some people get let off. It's not fair. So in that situation, what you do, you make sure you bring in some parking enforcers who live in a different city. I've already talked about fines. There is still a political lead required though, because not after you've implemented parking management, but before you implement parking management, you'll have a lot of criticism. After you implement it, if you do it right, and most places do it right, after you've implemented it, people realise, hey, this works, and it's not the end of the world, and actually it's improved things, so we like it. But in the run-up, in the lead-up to implementing it, you can get a lot of criticism, and that needs some strong leadership. This is an interesting example from Amsterdam, and more cities around Europe. So another one that's doing this is Krakow now. More and more cities are taking their parking revenue, which in Amsterdam from on-street parking fees is 160 million euros a year. And they use 39% of it goes into the city budget, the general funds. 38% is to operate the system and improve it. And 23% is dedicated to sustainable mobility, cycling, public transport, safety, other stuff, streetscape. Yeah. And they make that clear to people about where that money goes. Maybe it would be useful to make it a bit clearer where the 39% goes, but still, that kind of principle is good for building acceptability. Now, I just want to tell you about some Park for Sump outputs. That's the project that I'm working on about parking and sustainable urban mobility plans. First of all, there's a tool. I haven't really got time to go into it in detail, but there's a ParkPad tool. This is a tool for reviewing your parking policy in a city and deciding in a consensus way how to make changes, what improvements need to be made. So how have we done so far? Where do we need to go? Yeah. And the cities that have done it have found it useful. We need some more ParkPad cities here within the project to test it. It's free because it's still in the development stage. If you're interested for your city, it would probably have to be a European city, but if you are interested, please get in touch. There's a number of really good videos. I know some project videos that you get from these projects aren't particularly good, but I have to say that all the videos that have been produced for Park for Sump are really, really interesting. They tell an excellent story. They contain lots of useful detail. You can see some of them are about parking policy. So, for example, for Sofia in Bulgaria, but some of them are about specific technologies. So the use of scan cards for enforcement in Rotterdam. Some of them are about the creation of a particular institutional structure to manage parking money. So these are really worthwhile watching. They're very good videos. And there's a really excellent publication called 10 Good Reasons, no more, good arguments, we've got more now, good arguments for parking management. So this brochure, and I was involved in writing it, in some detail. It takes the key arguments against parking management, like, you know, when shopkeepers say it drives away all our customers, and then it shows why those arguments are wrong or don't apply. And it presents other positive arguments for parking management as well, with data, with research, with sources. So you can download it in various languages. I believe that one's actually Croatian there on the right. And you can download it at that website. But there's one part for some output. Well, it's not a part for some output that I'd really like to recommend, because I noticed we have a lot of attendees from cities that are not in Europe, from cities in emerging economies. And the German Development Administration, GIZ, is very active in sustainable urban mobility. And it has produced, amongst other excellent publications, this one on on-street parking management. And I would absolutely heartily recommend this to people from cities in emerging economies, and we see such a city in the picture, but also most of the arguments and most of the technical advice in it. And there's a lot of technical advice on the instruments to use, on enforcement, on charging, on how to set the charge, on how to collect the charge, things like that. All those arguments and all that technical advice, they apply to cities in developed economy cities as well as emerging economy cities. So I heartily recommend that publication. And then just for a few, if you want to go to more training events, we're hopefully starting to run once again face-to-face training events. So there's one coming up in Zadar in Croatia, there's one in Warsaw, there's one that's going to be run in Belgrade, Lisbon, Greece, Northwest Romania, and many more countries as part of the Park for Some project. So if you're interested in attending, you should find more details on the Park for Some website, amongst others. Okay, so parking is a key aspect of urban mobility. It can be changed. Big impacts if you do so. Lots of resources that I've shown you for the Park for Some project. Thank you very much.
Yeah, thank you very much, Tom. Very useful in addition to the introduction to parking management and introduction to access regulation schemes. And also thank you for flagging these useful tools, instruments, and other capacity building opportunities.
Yeah, I was going to kind of close on that issue. I mean, the first thing I want to say is that the exercises and the presentations have shown how very interconnected parking, urban access control, and low emission zones are. So in a sense, they're all the same side of the, or different sides of the same coin, and very, very linked. And your presentations showed that, and you showed your insights into this interconnectedness. In relation to this question of sort of how do you bring about change? Can you bring about change? It's always a question that's interested me, occupied me. I've done quite a lot of my research on this. I know that when you're at the beginning of a change process, it looks like you never can change. But there are plenty of countries that I think have exhibited very significant change in the way that they manage their urban transport systems. And countries that have gone through a cycle of economic growth, you know, perhaps not quite as rapid as you see in emerging economy cities, but still very, very rapid. So I'll give you a couple of examples. The country where I'm actually sitting now, Spain. So Spain, of course, joined the European Union back in the early 90s, I think it was, at that point. It was actually a very car-dominated urban environment, despite the fact that car ownership was very, very low. Car ownership rose, lots of problems associated with that, but right across Spain, there was a reaction against that. I'm still getting to the bottom of why that might be, but you see in the majority of Spanish cities now, management of parking, low emission zones, access control zones, pedestrianisation, and an emphasis on a high quality urban environment that is not car dominated. And yet this is in a country that's gone through a very, very rapid period of economic growth and a very rapid growth in car ownership over that short period. Right. So if when I was in Spain 25 years ago, I thought, well, this place, you know, it's never going to change, but it has changed. Another example, I like to point to Eastern Germany, which of course used to be a communist country. And then in 1991 it became part of West Germany, and again went through a very, very rapid period of car ownership growth as people were finally able to buy cars, and this put enormous pressure on especially the urban areas, and but very, very quickly I think the East German cities learned from their West German counterparts and started to manage these effects of this car use. So it's not impossible to change, even at the country level. The other thing is, how do you change? I would strongly advise lobbying to test some of these ideas. So test the school street even temporarily, yeah, in one location where there's a lot of political support for the idea. Test ideas locally, demonstrate that they can work, and then you can roll them out further from there. Because when politicians see that actually it's not the end of the world when you do these things, and there is political support for these things, and they bring benefits, then they'll realize that doing them more broadly is actually politically sensible. So those are a few, very few thoughts on how you bring about change, and yes, change is possible. The other thing is, with a lot of these policies, the devil is in the detail. These are quite technical, in something like low emission zones and urban access zones, very technical issues. And I would refer you to those publications. And they're not CIVITAS publications, but the publications by GIZ, their Sustainable Urban Transport Planning publications, particularly the one about on-street parking management that I showed earlier, because not only do they talk about the policy and the benefits, but they talk about the implementation detail. And I think that is really, really important when you start to actually implement these measures. So I think those are the closing words that I'd like to give. But yeah, the overall message is change is possible. Sometimes when you're sat at the end of a situation that hasn't changed, you think it's impossible, but honestly, even in unlikely situations it is, although it can take sometimes decades for that change to come about, but it does happen. So thanks for listening, thanks for participating, and thanks to the organisers for running an excellent training event.
Thanks for these closing words, Tom. Thanks all for participating. I would really like to invite you to complete the survey, so that will help us to improve and make better trainings that are upcoming. So there's also an invitation in your email right now. Swanette has posted it in the chat, so it will only take a couple of minutes. Yeah, in this training again, in the end, we try to make the link between really practical tools and in the end how they relate to creating attractive cities. And in the end, politicians are not against this, citizens are not against this, but it's really the challenge to connect them to each other. So we try, if we were successful, you now know that, you know, the basic principles of parking management and UVARs, how these tools fit in the bigger picture, and key approaches to applying them. With the resources already referenced, you should be possible to further acquire further knowledge and skills about this, and that will help you in creating attractive cities, of course. Upcoming training activities, first one next week about transition management. Also, how to organize your pilots, first demonstrations, organize processes with innovators and people from the so-called regime, and how to mix them in order to make transitions. So that is next week. And then the 2nd of September, we continue with the miracle of traffic counting and citizens, science and engagement. So you are more than welcome to join us in these sessions as well. This is where we really conclude. Handouts will be provided. That will become somewhere coming days. So for now, Tom, thanks for your contribution. Cosimo, thanks for your contribution. Swanette, thanks for all the help and support. And to the rest of you, thanks for participating. See you next time.
Thank you.
Thank you. Bye.
Thank you. Bye.